I've translated testimony in 43 jurisdictions across 11 compact member systems, and I have been asked exactly once what I think of a case I was assigned to. It was an informal question, a colleague in the corridor outside Chamber 4 on Velsorin Station, the kind of thing people say when they're making conversation and don't expect an answer of any weight. "How's the lineage case going?" And I said something noncommittal about complexity and scheduling, because a certified compact translator doesn't offer opinions on proceedings. That's the first rule. That's the rule they put in the training manual and repeat at every recertification and print on the back of your certification badge in small letters. You're a conduit, a pipe. Words go in, words come out in the target language, and whatever passes through you is not yours. You do not hold it. You do not weigh it. You do not carry an opinion about it home. You render it faithfully and you move on to the next assignment. I've kept that rule for 19 years. I broke it once. I want to be precise about what happened in Chamber 4 on Velsorin Station, because the formal record of those proceedings is dry and procedural and accurate in every particular, and captures almost none of what it felt like to be standing at the translator's position for 6 days, while a 9-person compact administrative board argued about whether a small alien girl had the right to her own name. Records do what records do. They note what was said and who said it and when, and they assign each statement to its proper category, and they produce a document that is entirely true and entirely incomplete. Her name was Saya. I'll get to the part where she pointed at me. I'll get there. But I want you to understand the room first, because the room is what made the pointing matter. A gesture doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens inside a space with weight and history and expectation. And the space in this case was a compact administrative chamber on a diplomatic way station, where 9 officials had convened to decide what category a child's future would fall into, and where the child herself was required by law to be present, and not required by law to be spoken to. Velsorin Station sits at the gravitational midpoint between the Velthani home system and the compact's third administrative hub, which makes it a natural venue for proceedings that involve both jurisdictions. The station is not glamorous. It does not try to be. It is a working diplomatic waypoint, cargo bays on the lower decks, administrative offices and staff quarters on the middle rings, and a suite of formal chambers on the upper level designed to look more imposing than their actual square footage warrants. Carpeted floors, dark-paneled walls, long tables with inset data terminals and built-in water dispensers that make a soft gurgling sound at irregular intervals when the pressure in the line shifts. The kind of room that says weight and permanence to a certain kind of official, and that says, to a translator who has spent enough hours inside it, that the ventilation grid on the east wall drafts in winter, and the audio system near the secondary entrance has a feedback buzz that shows up on recordings if you place a communication device too close to the wall mount. I'd been in Chamber 4 7 times before the Velthani lineage case. I knew which chair got the draft and where to stand to avoid the buzz, and that the water in the dispensers was slightly over-mineralized and left a faint chalk taste that made long sessions harder. These are the things a translator accumulates across enough assignments. Not wisdom, exactly, but the granular working knowledge of rooms and systems, and the small physical conditions under which language gets done. The case file, which I reviewed the night before the first session, as I always do, with a cup of tea and my personal notation system, and no particular sense of foreboding, was 312 pages of compact administrative law applied to a specific genealogical dispute. The kind of file that is dense and technical and, in another context, might have been purely procedural. I've worked cases that were purely procedural. You stand at the podium and carry the language and go home, and the file joins the archive, and that's the whole of it. I expected this to be that kind of case. The short version of what it was actually about. A Velthani noble named Aviath Salu Marit had died 14 months earlier. He'd been a secondary House member of the Velthani Standing Council, and his death had been sudden, a vascular event, nothing contested or suspicious, just the sharp bad luck of a healthy man who wasn't. What was contested in the procedural and bureaucratic sense was his daughter, Saya. Her mother was Velthani-born, first caste, no dispute there. Her father was the complication. Aviath's lineage position had been challenged by a collateral branch of his house 19 years earlier. A challenge filed by two cousins who believed the house name inheritance should have gone differently when Aviath's father died, and who had pursued it through the compact administrative system with the patience of people who had more persistence than actual evidence. The challenge had been administratively suspended pending review 17 years earlier, when the reviewing board at the time had found the initial documentation insufficient but had not formally dismissed the case. Suspended, pending further evidence, a procedural limbo that everyone involved had, apparently, decided to treat as effectively resolved and move past. When Aviath died, the suspension became a problem. Compact Administrative Procedure 7.3 specifies that any unresolved lineage dispute affecting a deceased member's estate must be adjudicated before assets and status designations can transfer to direct descendants. The key word is unresolved. Suspended is not the same as resolved. The collateral branch, the two cousins, now older, represented by a sharp-eyed Velthani advocate named Teth Vorel who had made a career out of these precise procedural ambiguities, had filed to complete the original challenge. If the challenge succeeded, Aviath's lineage position would be retroactively unconfirmed, and Saya's status as a recognized houseline child would dissolve with it. She would not inherit the house name. She would not inherit the council seat designation. She would be assigned to ward status under Compact Administrative Code 9, which meant a compact-appointed guardian, a compact-administered estate, and a future negotiated entirely by people who had not spent a single day of their lives in the room with her. This is what the 9-person board had convened to decide. Saya's mother, Varit Selu Marit, dark-voiced, composed, carrying the particular stillness of someone who has been terrified for 14 months and has learned to hold it without letting it show, was represented by her own advocate, a compact-side lawyer named Hanover Rose. Hanover was good. I'd seen him work 2 prior cases and I knew the quality of his preparation. He knew Procedure 7.3 and its 17 subsections better than most members of the board that was about to hear him argue it. He also knew when to stop talking, which is rarer. And Saya was present because Compact Administrative Code 14 requires minor children who are the subject of lineage proceedings to be physically present for the formal sessions. It does not require the board to address them. It does not require anyone to explain what is happening to them. It does not require anyone to ask what they think. Code 14 just requires the body to be in the room. Seat the child. Proceed. I was there because Velthani is a complex language, secondary sensory structures, tonal register markers, 14 grammatical cases, and a lateral resonance layer that carries emotional and contextual information that standard simply does not have a clean equivalent for. The board members were all compact certified, fluent in standard, and spoke varying degrees of functional Velthani. But for formal proceedings of this class, at this jurisdictional level, you need a compact certified translator at the tertiary level. That was me. I had been assigned to the case 3 weeks earlier, reviewed the file, and arrived at Velsoren Station the evening before the first session. I arrived at Chamber 4 on the first morning, took my position at the translator's station, a small podium along the north wall, slightly elevated, with a clear sightline to both the board table and the advocate positions, and watched the room fill. The board came in first, 9 officials of various species, ranks, and jurisdictions, settling into their assigned seats with the practiced efficiency of people who spend most of their working lives in rooms like this one. Then the advocates and their support staff. Then, through a side door that I recognized as the family entrance. It came directly from a waiting area, bypassing the main corridor, Varret and Saya. Varret moved like someone crossing a minefield, careful, deliberate, every step placed with full knowledge of its weight. Her secondary sensory structures, the paired tactile filaments at her temples, a Velthani biological feature used for fine emotional and environmental registration, were held close and still, pulled in tight in the controlled formal mode that Velthani adults use in high-stakes social situations. The equivalent of a face held carefully neutral. She sat beside Hanover Rose and placed her hands flat on the table in front of her and looked at the board chair without expression. Saya moved like a child who has been told exactly how to behave and has decided to comply precisely enough that no one can find fault with it, and no further. She was small waist-height on me, which for a Velthani child of her approximate age was about right, perhaps slightly slight in the way children are when they've been under sustained stress for an extended period. Silver-pale skin, the secondary shade coloring that marks the Velthani coastal branch lines, with a faint iridescence visible at the temples where the light caught it at the right angle. Oversized amber eyes, the way Velthani children's eyes always are in proportion to the face, built for full-spectrum registration that adults train down to controlled acuity over time. Pointed ears, translucent at the tips the way they are in young Velthani, before the cartilage fully hardens. Her hair was white-silver, pulled back in a formal braid that someone had tied with considerable care and time, and she was wearing a ceremonial house robe in deep blue with the Marriott house line embroidering at the cuffs and collar. Very deliberate, very much a statement, made without words, about who she was and what was being disputed in this room. She sat down next to her mother without being told to. She placed her hands in her lap the same way her mother had placed hers on the table, and then she looked at the room. Not at the board, not at the advocates. She looked at the room, the walls, the data terminals, the audio equipment, the ceiling panels, with a slow, complete attention that I recognized, in a way I couldn't quite articulate at the time, as assessment. She was reading the space, learning it, deciding what kind of room it was and what the rules were and where the exits went. Her eyes came to me last, the translator at the north podium, and she held the look for exactly 2 seconds before moving on, unhurried, factual. I made a note in my translation log, which I always keep in longhand parallel to the official recording, child present, composed, observational. Then I crossed it out because it is not a translator's job to characterize the subject of the proceedings. I wrote instead, Velthani minor, Saya Aviath Marriott, present and seated. Then the board chair called the session to order and I got to work. The first day was procedural. Teth Vorel laid out the challenge in precise, layered formal Velthani Register 4, the legal ceremonial level, and I rendered it into standard for the board record. Hanover Rose responded, and I rendered that back into Velthani for Varret's benefit. The board asked clarifying questions. The advocates answered. Compact case law was cited. Specific procedural subsections were read into the record. No one spoke to Saya. No one spoke to Varret except through the formal advocate structure. The session ran for 4 hours, broke for the midday interval, reconvened for 2 more, and concluded at the standard end time. Throughout all 6 hours, Saya sat in her chair and watched the proceedings with the amber eyes and the steady attention she had brought into the room with her. She didn't fidget. She didn't whisper to her mother. She didn't look at the door or the ceiling or her hands. She watched whoever was speaking, the board chair, Teth Vorel, Hanover Rose, with that same steady inventory, and she listened to words that were largely in a formal register she would not have been taught, because children aren't taught formal Velthani until their early teens, the way children aren't taught the specialized vocabulary of law in any language until they have reason to learn it. She listened anyway, the way you listen when you know that what is being said concerns you directly, and understanding it is the most important thing you can do right now, even if full comprehension is out of reach. At the end of the session, as people were gathering documents and the board chair was dictating summary notes to the record system, I watched Varrett lean down and say something to Saya in a very quiet voice. Intimate register, close enough that the words didn't carry to the podium. Saya looked at her mother for a moment, then nodded once, deliberately, and then looked back at the room, emptying now, officials filing out through the primary exit with the same composed expression. I finished my log notes and left. On the second day, the board moved into the genealogical record review. 19 years of documented challenge procedure, counter-filings, administrative suspensions, and the original lineage documentation that the challenge was based on. This is the kind of material that is almost impossible to render cleanly from formal Velthani legal register into standard, because the two systems don't carve up the concept of lineage and identity at the same joints. Velthani lineage law treats house name status as a living relational structure, not a fixed attribute you either have or don't have, but an ongoing web of acknowledged connections that has to be actively maintained, and that can be witnessed and confirmed by the people inside it. Standard administrative law treats lineage status as binary, confirmed or unconfirmed, present in the record or absent, a checkbox with two states. I spent most of the second day in the grinding, careful work of finding standard equivalents for concepts that do not have standard equivalents, and flagging for the record each place where I was approximating rather than translating directly. This is the translator's obligation in cases where the languages do not match. Be honest about the seams. Saya watched. At the midday break, I was reviewing my notes at the podium when I realized she was still in the chamber. Her mother and Hanover Rose had stepped out. I could hear them in the corridor, discussing something in low, urgent voices that I made no effort to catch. The board had cleared. Teth Vorel and his support staff were gone. 2 security officers remained at the primary door. And Saya was sitting alone at the table with her hands still folded in her lap, looking at the board chair's empty seat. I should have left. What I did instead was walk the 2 or 3 steps to the edge of the podium's raised section and say, in Velthani, a standard register greeting, the kind you'd use with any minor you didn't know, pitched at the everyday level rather than the formal ceremonial. Something a tutor might say, or a neighbor. I said, "These rooms are heavy when they empty out, aren't they?" It wasn't wisdom. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't a professional decision made after careful thought. It was the thing that came out of my mouth when I looked at a small child sitting alone in a formal chamber, looking at the seat of the person who was deciding her future, and it was simply the true thing. Those rooms are heavy when they empty. I have sat in them myself after long and difficult sessions, and felt the weight of the proceedings pressed into the walls and the carpet and the table, the residue of all the formal language and all the formal stakes, and it is heavy in the body in a way that takes a while to clear. She looked at me. Her secondary sensory structures, the paired filaments at her temples, held carefully still all morning in the Velthani-controlled formal mode, shifted fractionally, not opening fully. More like a door with a loosened latch, still closed but no longer held by will alone. She said in standard register Velthani, a child's version of it, careful and deliberate, "You are the one who carries the words." "I am," I said. She considered this, then she said, "Do you carry them to me too?" I held that for a moment. A translator, technically, carries words between the designated parties in a formal proceeding. A minor child present under Code 14 is not a designated party. She is the subject of the proceeding, the thing being discussed, in the procedural sense, but she is not a party. She is not addressed by the board. She is not addressed by the advocates except to manage logistics. She is certainly not addressed by the translator. The translator is a function. The function has a defined scope. "I can," I said. "Then tell me," she said, "what they said about the name." And I did. Not the legal argument as it had been rendered, not the cases cited, not the procedure numbers, not the dense formal language of the challenge filing. I told her what the case was. In plain Velthani, at the register level she would have used in school or at home, I explained it. The house name is being questioned. Your father's position in the house was never fully settled in the legal sense before he died because of a very old disagreement that was put aside and never finished. The board is deciding whether that disagreement can be finished now, and whether finishing it the wrong way would change what you are allowed to call yourself and what you are allowed to inherit from your father. And what happens to you depends on how they answer that question. She listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she said, "My father knew his name." "Yes," I said. "He knew it from the inside," she said. "That's what he told me. He said a name isn't something they give you. It's something you carry from the inside out, and they can see it if they look." I wrote that down in my personal log. Not in the official translation record. It had no place there. In the small private notebook I carry alongside the official log. I wrote it because I didn't want to forget it, and because in 19 years of translating across 11 systems and 43 jurisdictions, I had not heard that particular thought expressed quite that way. "Will you carry that to them?" she asked. "I'll carry what you tell me to carry," I said, "in the sessions, when you have the chance to speak." She looked at me for another moment with the amber inventory. Then she nodded, once decided, and looked back at the empty board chair. I returned to my podium when I heard Varret and Hanover returning to the chamber. I told myself it was a midday break conversation that I would not report to the board because it was not relevant to the translation record. I told myself I had not crossed any meaningful line. I had greeted a child. I had answered her questions in plain language. I had agreed to carry her words. Translators carry words. That is what translators do. The scope of what I had agreed to carry was somewhat outside my formal mandate, and the recipient of my afternoon's translation work had been a minor child rather than a designated preceding party, but the function was the same function. That's what I told myself. The function felt different now. The third day was the harder one. Teth Vorel's team presented the original challenge documentation from 19 years earlier, and it was, and I want to be honest about this, because honesty is the translator's actual job, and I extend it beyond the formal record when I can, not as clear-cut as the challenge implied. The original filing had identified a gap in the genealogical record, a period of 8 months during which Aviath's lineage position had not been actively registered in the compact system. Teth Vorel's argument was that this gap meant the position had never been properly confirmed, that the absence of continuous registration was evidence of discontinuous status. Hanover Rose was arguing that the gap was the product of an administrative error during a system migration that the Velthani House Registry had made on their end, a documented failure in their own record-keeping system, a thing that happened to the record and not to the person. A registry's error, he argued, could not be counted against the individual whose status the registry was supposed to be tracking. Both of these arguments were coherent. The law was not crisp on this particular question. I could tell, from the way the board members were listening and the specific questions the chair was asking, that it was not crisp to them either. Saya watched Hanover when he was speaking. She watched him the way you watch someone who is carrying something heavy, and you are hoping with everything in you that they have the strength for it. I carried the words back and forth across the chamber. At one point, Teth Vorel made an argument in Formal Register 4 that hinged on a term I had flagged in my precession notes, Velsathos, which refers to the authenticated and continuous presence of a house-line connection, the quality of being genuinely and recognizably there in the record as a full member, not a marginal one, not a disputed one, but an acknowledged and woven-in member whose place in the web is not in question. There is no standard equivalent. The closest approximation I could construct was confirmed connective presence in the house record, which is accurate but loses the relational texture, the sense that the presence has to be felt by the people inside the house and not merely written by the administrative system. I stopped mid-sentence in my rendering. I said, for the record, in the standard translator's notation, the term Velsathos does not have a direct standard equivalent. I am rendering it as confirmed connective presence in the house record. This is an approximation, and I am flagging it as such. The board chair noted it, and the record system logged it, and I moved on. During the midday break on the third day, Saya was in the room again. She had been staying each day. I realized, watching her mother for the cue, reading the rhythm of the break, finding a way to remain in the chamber while the others cleared out. She had figured out how to do this without being obvious about it, which told me something about how carefully she was paying attention to everything. She said the big word, the one you stopped for. What does it mean? I told her. Velsathos. I gave her the plain version, the one I'd have given a student. It means being genuinely there in the record, not as a name someone wrote down, but as a real thread in the weave that the people around you can feel and confirm. The difference between being listed and being known. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My father had it. I could feel it in him every day, in everything he said about the house and our people." "I know," I said. And then I realized I didn't know it in the technical, evidentiary sense, and started to qualify, and she looked at me with the amber eyes and I stopped qualifying. "Can I say that to them?" she asked. "In there when they're talking?" "If the chair allows it," I said. "If there's a moment." "I'll carry it." "Then I want to say it," she said, "when there's a moment." That afternoon, during the formal session, at a point when the board chair paused the proceedings to allow the advocates to review a newly submitted supplementary document, Saya raised her hand. The room went momentarily strange. There is no other word for it. A 9-year-old Velthani child in a formal house robe had raised her hand in Chamber 4 in the manner of a student in a classroom, and the room, which had been running in its formal groove for 3 days, did not know what track to move to. The board chair looked at Hanover Rose. Hanover looked at Varrett. Varrett looked at Saya with an expression I caught only the edge of from my position. Not alarmed, not pleased, something quieter and more complicated than either. The expression of a parent who has just watched their child do something unexpected and is still deciding what to think about it. The board chair said, in standard, with the careful precision of someone reaching for protocol, "The minor child is not a designated speaker in these proceedings." "I can translate," I said, "if the board wishes to receive the minor child's statement." There was a pause. The chair looked at me. Several board members looked at each other. The legal principle at stake was minor and procedurally ambiguous. A child who is present under Code 14 has no formal right to speak, but nothing in the code explicitly prohibits the board from receiving a statement on a discretionary basis. The chair knew this. I could see her calculating it. Briefly, the chair said. I turned to Saya and said in plain Velthani, "Speak, I'll carry it." She stood up. She was small. The chamber made her smaller, the way formal spaces make small things smaller, but she stood with the same deliberateness she had applied to everything since she'd walked through the family entrance on day 1. She looked at the board. She looked at the board chair specifically, the way she'd been watching the chair's seat during the breaks. And she said in plain Velthani, clearly and without rush, "My father had Velsathos. I know because he was present to me. He was present in the way that the record cannot see. I understand the record cannot see it, but that I felt every day of my life with him. The record has a gap in it. My father did not have a gap in him. I am his daughter. I carry what he gave me from the inside out, the way he told me a name works. That is not something a gap in a registry can undo. I carried it into standard word by word, as faithfully as I knew how." When I finished, the room was quiet. Tethvoro made a move to respond, and the board chair held up one hand, and Tethvoro went still. The chair looked at Saya for a long moment, really looked at her. the direct and specific attention that she had not given the child in 3 days of proceedings, and then made a notation in the document in front of her. The session ended 20 minutes later. Days 4 and 5 were the full legal argument, and they were long. Hanover Rose was brilliant. He deconstructed the original challenge filing with the precision of someone who had spent 3 weeks doing nothing else, showing the board the specific points at which the challenge's logic broke down. The registry error was not only documented, it was documented by the registry itself, in an internal audit report filed 8 months after the migration failure, which Hanover had obtained through a discovery request, and which Tethvorel had apparently not seen or had not taken seriously enough. The audit report named Avyath Salumarit's registration gap as one of 14 similar gaps produced by the same migration failure. 14. A systemic problem, not an individual one. There were 3 prior compact precedents for administrative errors of this type, and in all 3, the reviewing board had found that a registry's own documented systemic error could not be attributed to the named individual and could not be used to undermine confirmed status. Hanover laid them out in order, with the specific language from each ruling read into the record. He cited Procedure 7.3 subsection 9, which nobody in the room, including, I suspected from the expression on her face, the board chair, had read with sufficient attention before the proceeding began. Subsection 9 specifies conditions under which a documented systemic administrative failure constitutes grounds for procedural dismissal of a retroactive challenge. Tethvorel pushed back hard, and it was good opposition. He found the seams in the precedents, the ways the prior cases differed from this one in jurisdictional detail, in the specific mechanism of the registration gap, in the timeline relative to the challenge filing. He was precise and thorough, and he knew his material. He argued that regardless of the cause of the gap, the board was required under Code 7.3 to make a determination, and that the determination had to be based on the record as it stood, not on the intentions or circumstances behind the record's condition. He wasn't wrong about the last part. The board did have to make a determination. What he had counted on, I thought, was what the determination would be. I carried all of it, back and forth, formal register to standard and standard back to formal register, for 2 full days. My voice was sore by the end of each session, and my hands, I take handwritten notes alongside the official recording, an old habit from my first years in the profession, were cramped from the pace. I went back to my quarters each night and reviewed the session records and ate dinner without particularly tasting it, and turned the case over in my head without allowing myself to arrive at an opinion. I allowed myself to arrive at an opinion. On the evening of day 5, I wrote in my personal log a single sentence: I don't know what the board will decide tomorrow. And under it, after a long pause, she should get to keep her name. I had not written anything like that about a case in 19 years. I looked at it for a while. I didn't cross it out. I closed the notebook and went to sleep. The final session was the 6th day. The board reconvened at the standard time. The chamber filled in the same order it always did. I took my position at the north podium. The chair opened by announcing that the board had completed its deliberations and was prepared to issue its ruling in open session, with the formal written determination to follow within 3 working days. Standard procedure. I had heard this opening dozens of times, and it had always been the clean procedural thing it was supposed to be. Saya was in her seat. Her house robe was immaculate. Someone had pressed it overnight, and the embroidery at the cuffs was as crisp as it had been on day 1. Her braid was fresh. She was sitting the same way she'd sat on day 1, hands in her lap, spine straight, amber eyes on the room. Varrett was still, the particular stillness of someone who has done everything they can do and now has to wait for the world to answer. There was someone else in the chamber I hadn't seen in the earlier sessions, a tall Velthani male, silver-dark with the coastal branch coloring, who had slipped in through the family entrance at the start of the session and taken a chair along the wall rather than at the table. His secondary sensory structures were open in the careful default mode of someone in a formal space, controlled, but not pulled tight the way Varret held hers. He had amber eyes, the same shade as Saya's. I checked the attendance record at the midday break when I had a moment. His name was in the file as Korath Aviath Merritt, Saya's uncle, her father's brother, who had traveled from the Velthani home system to be present for the ruling. He was the one the house line would pass through, in practical terms, now that Aviath was gone. He was the one whose active acknowledgement would matter going forward, in the way that the law and the living both have to be satisfied before anything is truly settled. The board chair began to read the ruling. I will not give you all 11 paragraphs of it, with their citations and statutory language and formal compact procedural qualifications. I will give you what it came down to, which is the part that mattered. The board found that the original challenge was procedurally valid under Code 7.3 and that a formal determination was required. They found that the 8-month registration gap existed in the record and had to be addressed. They found, and here I rendered Hanover's 3 precedents paying off, that the documentation of systemic administrative failure on the part of the Velthani House Registry, as confirmed by the registry's own internal audit, met the threshold established under Procedure 7.3 subsection 9. They found, therefore, that the challenge, while validly filed, lacked sufficient evidentiary basis to overcome the presumption of continuous lineage status, that compact law extends to direct descendants of recognized house line members in the absence of evidence of intentional concealment or fraud. The gap in the record was a gap made by the system, not by the man. They found for Saya. The ruling wasn't finished when it happened. The chair was reading the final clause, the formal statement confirming that the minor child's status as a recognized house line descendant of the Merritt family was upheld, and the ward status motion was denied, and Saya stood up. Nobody told her to stand. Nobody cued her. The ruling had not been finished. The chair was mid-sentence. Saya stood up from her chair with the same deliberateness she had applied to every single thing she'd done in Chamber 4 for 6 days, and she turned, and she looked at me. I don't know how to put cleanly into words what happens when a small alien child looks directly at you with amber eyes that have been paying careful attention for 6 days and now are saying something that doesn't need language. I've translated in 43 jurisdictions. I've been looked at by diplomats and generals and 3 separate heads of compact member states. None of it was quite like that. She raised her hand and pointed at me. Clear, unambiguous. A small arm extended toward the north podium, finger directed at the human standing there with his cramped hand and his handwritten notes, and 19 years of learned professional distance from everything that passed through him. Then she turned and she faced her parents. Varret had gone very still in a different way than any of the ways she had been still across 6 days. Not the controlled stillness of contained fear. Something else, something I didn't have a word for in any of the 11 languages I work in. Korath Aviath Merritt, from his chair along the wall, had straightened almost imperceptibly, and his secondary sensory structures had shifted open another increment. Saya looked at her mother. She looked at her uncle. She held their faces for a moment, the amber inventory moving between them, and then she spoke. In plain Velthani, standard register, not formal ceremonial, the register she used with me. She said, "He is the one who carried the words to me, every day. He is the one who told me what was happening in this room. He is the one who asked me what I wanted to say and then said it when they let me speak. He told me about Velsathos and what it means and why it matters. He told me I could speak." She was still pointing at me. "I choose him," she said, "as the one who was present." I have been asked to translate that phrase in the years since, when I've told this story to people who wanted to understand it. Velthani doesn't map cleanly into standard, as I've mentioned multiple times in the course of this account, but I'll try one more time with this particular phrase. The construction she used, the declaration of chosen presence, is a formal Velthani relational claim, not a common one in everyday use. It comes from an older register, from the tradition of naming the people who stood with you in difficult times. In adult usage, it establishes a recognized bond of acknowledged witness, the formal naming of someone who was present in a time of need, who held the position that needed holding, who did the thing that needed doing when others did not do it. In adult Velthani social and legal structure, such declarations carry real weight. They go into house records. They are not made carelessly. In a 9-year-old's mouth, in a compact administrative chamber, pointed at a translator standing at his podium. I could not move. The board chair had stopped reading the ruling. Korath Aviath Marit was looking at his niece. His secondary sensory structures had opened fully, the way Velthani sensory structures go when something catches them without preparation, and the preparation doesn't matter anymore. Varit had her eyes closed. She opened them. She looked at Saya for a long moment, long enough that the room waited entirely, and then she looked at me. I have a policy. I have a professional policy of not engaging with the family of a minor child during proceedings. I have a policy of not expressing reactions. I have a policy of standing at my podium and being the function. Varit said, in standard, clearly, without translator necessary for the record, we acknowledge the declaration. Korath said in Velthani, and I rendered it automatically into standard because that is what I do, because the function runs even when everything else has stopped. The house acknowledges it also. The chamber was very quiet. The board chair looked at me. I could not read her expression. Can you, the chair began. She declared me as a witness presence, I said. It is a Velthani formal relational claim, the designation for a person who was authentically present in a time of need, who carried what needed to be carried, who held what needed to be held. She is naming who helped her. The chair was quiet for a moment. Then, for the record. For the record, I said. The chair returned to the final clause of the ruling and read it to its end. The ward status motion was denied. Saya Aviath Marit's status as a recognized house line descendant of the Marit family was confirmed. The proceeding was formally concluded. When the room emptied, Saya walked past the translator's podium on her way to the family exit. She stopped. She looked up at me. She was small. I've said that a number of times now, because it keeps being true and relevant. But she looked up at me the way someone looks up at a thing they have chosen deliberately and are not uncertain about. She said, "Thank you for carrying the words." I said, "Thank you for having one's worth carrying." She considered this. Then she nodded, once in the way she always nodded, once, decided, done, and followed her mother and uncle out of Chamber 4. I stood at my podium for a while after the room cleared. The ventilation grid on the east wall was making its draft. The water dispensers were gurgling softly at irregular intervals. The carpet held the residue of 6 days of proceedings the way those rooms always do, pressed into the fibers, weight without visible form. I had broken a professional rule. I had engaged with the subject of a proceeding. I had translated a greeting during a recess, answered questions, explained legal concepts, agreed to carry a child's words. The board chair had noted my conduct on day 3 with a flag in the session record. I did not know yet what the professional consequence would be, but I understood that a consequence was coming. 6 weeks later, a formal notation in my certification record, 1 paragraph, the conduct described in accurate terms, a finding that the interaction fell outside standard translator protocols for proceedings of this class. No suspension, no revocation, a notation. I read it once, I filed it. 3 years later, what came from Velsoren Station in the post was not a notation. It was a folded document, sealed with the Marit House mark, a small stylized emblem, the coastal branch sigil, two curved lines meeting at a point, pressed into wax the color of the blue in Saya's house robe. Inside was a single page in formal Velthani. I translated it myself at my desk without help, which is the translator's particular vanity. You always want to render your own important things. It said that the House of Marat, acting through its senior member, wished to formally acknowledge the service of Edric Vale, compact certified translator, tertiary level, rendered during the lineage proceeding of the Velsoran session. It said that he had fulfilled the function of Velsatho's witness, a person authentically and recognizably present in a time of need, whose presence was real in the living sense and not merely administrative, and that this was acknowledged and would be retained in the house record. It said that Saya Aviath Marat, now 12 years of age, had requested that this document be prepared and sent, and that the house had endorsed the request without reservation. It was signed by Korath Aviath Marat, in the formal script of a senior house member. Below the formal signature, in careful handwriting that was still working toward its adult form but was already deliberate and unhurried, the same deliberateness she had applied to everything, was a single line in standard. He told me I could speak. I wanted the record to know. I keep that document in the top drawer of my desk, not displayed, just there where I know it is and can put my hand on it when I need to. I've translated in 43 jurisdictions, and I have been a conduit for 19 years plus the years since. And the rule is that you carry the words and you don't hold them. And the rule is right for everything the rule is designed for. The one time I brought the words to a small child who needed to know what was happening in the room deciding her life. She stood up in that room and pointed at me in front of her parents and her uncle and 9 compact board members, and said what she said. I've thought about it for years, whether I should have held more carefully to protocol, what it cost and what it gave, whether the outcome would have been the same without any of it. I keep coming back to what she said to me on the second day, in the empty chamber, when the others were in the corridor. A name isn't something they give you. It's something you carry from the inside out, and they can see it if they look. She was right about that. She was 9 years old and she had it exactly right. I looked at her. That's all I did. I looked at her and I asked what she needed and I carried what she gave me. She pointed at me and I couldn't believe it. I still can't entirely. But she kept her name. That's the part I'm certain of. Whatever else is in the file, the notation, the document, the long quiet years between one and the other. She stood up in that room and used her 30 seconds, and the board chair stopped reading, and the house acknowledged it, and somewhere in a Velthani house record is the notation of a human translator who was present. A conduit technically. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's the whole of what someone needs, a channel that actually reaches them, a pipe that runs both directions, a person in the room who looked directly at the real thing and asked it what it wanted to say. She told me I carried it. That's the job, even when the job is larger than the manual wrote it. A translator is a function. I believe that. I believed it when I started, and I believe it now, and I'll believe it until the last case I work. The function is important. Getting language right across the space between two people who don't share one is not a small thing. It's the architecture that everything else gets built on, the foundation that most people only notice when it fails. You do not take that lightly. You do not introduce yourself into it. You do not make the translation about the translator. But there is a version of the function that has been interpreted over the years and across the profession to mean something narrower than it should. Carry the formal language between designated parties. Render it accurately. Stop there. And there are cases, most cases maybe, where that interpretation is exactly right, where the proceeding requires only the clean, faithful pipe, and any deviation from it would introduce noise or bias or error. I understand that. I have worked those cases and I will work them again. Chamber 4 was not that case. Chamber 4 had a child in it who needed the language to reach her, and the formal structure of the proceeding had not built a channel for it. And no one in the room was going to build one because no one in the room was looking at the child the way you have to look at a person to see what they actually need. They were looking at the proceeding. They were looking at the documents and the precedents and the procedural challenge. They were doing their jobs, the jobs as written. I did my job as written and 1 degree more. I opened a channel that the manual hadn't specified, and I ran the words through it both directions, to the child and back. And she used the channel the way a 9-year-old who has been sitting in a formal chamber for 6 days listening to people decide her life will use a channel when someone finally runs one to her. She used it completely, without hesitation, because she had been ready the whole time and had only been waiting for the wire to reach her. She pointed at me in front of that room, and I couldn't believe it. The notation in my file says outside standard protocols. The document in my desk drawer says Velsatho's witness. Both are true at the same time. I've made my peace with holding both.